Soren Valdren had not intended to open the box. It was small, carved from dark cherry wood, and it had fallen from the top shelf of the reading room when a servant jostled the bookcase during the evening cleaning. The clasp had broken on impact, scattering folded papers across the stone floor like pale leaves shaken loose by a storm. He recognized her handwriting immediately. The careful, slanting script that leaned slightly to the right, as though each word was reaching towards something it could not quite touch. He should not have picked one up. He should not have unfolded it. He should not have read the first line. "Dear Mother." Soren's chest tightened. Eloin's mother had been dead for over 20 years. He knew that much from the treaty documents, from the clinical summary of her lineage that had been presented to him before the arrangement was finalized. Eloin Ashwick, orphaned in infancy, raised by village healers in the border territory of Cairn Moor. No family, no title, no fortune, chosen as a political bride because her people needed protection and he needed their loyalty. A transaction, nothing more. Dear Mother. He looked at me today, not past me, not through me, but at me. For 3 heartbeats I existed in his world, and then the door closed again, and I was on the outside. I keep thinking if I stand in the right place at the right moment, the door will stay open. But doors do not stay open for women like me. I know that. I have always known that. Soren lowered the page. His hand was trembling, a fine tremor he could not control, and the wolf inside him, the creature that had been dying for months, stirred with sudden, desperate recognition. He reached for another letter he should not have. He knew, even as his fingers closed around the paper, that he was trespassing into a place he had no right to enter. But his hands would not obey him. Dear Mother, I know he is dying. He thinks no one can see it, but I see everything. The way his hand shakes when he thinks no one is watching. The way his eyes have lost their light. He is carrying something terrible inside him, and he will not let anyone close enough to help. I want to shake him. I want to scream at him. I want to press my hands against his chest and hold whatever is breaking inside him together with my bare fingers. But I am his wife, in name only, and names do not give you the right to save someone who has not asked to be saved. Soren's breath left him like he had been struck. He sank into the chair behind him, the letters clutched in both hands, and felt something fracture behind his ribs. Not his wolf, not the curse. Something far more fragile that he had not known was still intact. He read the last letter in the box. The ink was fresher, the handwriting less steady, as though her hand had been shaking when she wrote it. Dear Mother, if I do not survive what I am about to do, I need you to know that I chose it. He will think I was foolish. He will think I threw my life away for a man who never wanted me. But that is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I have loved him since the night he carried a stable boy 2 miles through the rain to the infirmary, because no one else would go out in the storm. The whole truth is that I felt the bond the first time I touched him, and I never told him, because I did not want him to feel trapped. He married me out of duty. I will not make him love me out of obligation, but I can choose to save him. And he is worth choosing, Mother. Even if he never knows it, he is worth choosing. The letter fell from Soren's fingers. He sat motionless in the dark reading room, surrounded by scattered pages, each one a window into a woman he had shared a roof with for 3 months and never once truly seen. The wolf inside him howled, a sound so raw and broken it reverberated through his bones and teeth and the hollows behind his eyes. She had known about the bond. She had known, and she had said nothing, because she had not wanted him to feel obligated, and now she was gone. But that part of the story comes later. This part begins weeks earlier, on the day Soren Valdren married a woman he did not love and did not even bother to look at while he did it. The wedding was beautiful, everyone said so. The great hall of Thornhold had been draped in silver and evergreen, the chandeliers lit with 1,000 candles, the stone floors strewn with winter roses that perfumed the air with something almost sweet enough to mask the tension beneath it all. 400 guests filled the hall, nobles, diplomats, military commanders, all watching in silence. As the Alpha King of Valdrin took a wife, Eloin stood at the altar in a borrowed dress. It was stunning. Ivory silk embroidered with silver thread, and it did not fit properly. The bodice was too tight across her ribs, and the hem had been taken up hastily that morning, leaving a faint crease where the fabric had been folded. No one would notice from a distance, but Eloin noticed. She noticed everything, because if she stopped noticing small things, she would have to notice the large things standing beside her. Soren Valdrin was enormous. That was the first word that came to mind, and it was entirely inadequate. He stood half a head taller than any man in the room, broad through the shoulders and chest in a way that made the ceremonial armor he wore look like it had been forged around a mountain. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that might have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and hard lines, and his jaw was set so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. He did not look at her. Not when she walked the length of the hall toward him. Not when she took her place beside him at the altar. Not when the officiant spoke the binding words that would tie their lives together until death or dissolution. His gray eyes stayed fixed on some point above the crowd, distant and unreachable, and his voice, when he spoke his vows, was flat and measured, each word delivered with the mechanical precision of a man reading terms of surrender. Eloin's voice shook when she spoke hers. She had practiced in her room that morning, standing in front of a cracked mirror, willing her voice to be steady. It was not steady. The words came out thin and fragile, barely carrying past the first row, and she saw the flicker of something, pity perhaps, cross the face of the officiant before he looked away. "You may seal the bond," the officiant said. Soren turned to her for the first time. His eyes met hers, and the impact of his gaze was so immediate, so physical, that Eloin's breath stuttered in her chest. Cold. His eyes were so cold, like looking into deep water where the light could not reach. He leaned down, and his lips brushed her forehead in a gesture so perfunctory it might have been a stamp on a document. Then he straightened, turned back to the crowd, and it was done. The feast that followed was interminable. Eloin sat beside her new husband, at the high table, and ate food she could not taste while music she could not hear played somewhere in the distance. Nobles approached in a steady stream to offer congratulations. They addressed Soren. They did not address her. A few offered her tight, polite smiles that never reached their eyes. One woman, tall and sharp-featured, with a cascade of auburn hair, looked Eloin up and down with open contempt, before turning her attention entirely to the king. "A border girl," Eloin heard someone murmur behind her. They could not find anyone better? She kept her spine straight, and her face composed and pretended the words did not land like stones against her skin. That night, a servant led her to the queen's chambers. The room was vast, cold, and impeccably furnished. A fire burned in the grate, casting long shadows across the canopied bed. Fresh flowers sat on the vanity. Everything was perfect, and none of it was hers. Soren did not come. She waited for 2 hours, sitting on the edge of that enormous bed in her wedding dress, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the fire crack and pop. At some point, the waiting stopped feeling like anticipation and started feeling like an answer. She understood. The marriage was a signature on a treaty. She was a clause in an agreement, not a woman he intended to share his life with. Eloin changed, out of the borrowed dress, folding it carefully over the back of a chair. She climbed into the bed, which was too large and too soft and smelled of lavender soap that was not hers. Sleep would not come, so she did what she had always done when the silence became too heavy to carry alone. She pulled a piece of parchment from the small travel case she had brought from Cairnmore and began to write. "Dear Mother, I married a king today. He did not look at me once. The dress was beautiful, but it did not fit. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about this arrangement. I am writing to you from a room that could hold our entire cottage 3 times over. The bed is the size of a small field. I would trade every inch of silk in this palace for one of your scratchy wool blankets and the sound of rain on our old tin roof. But you are not here. And this is where I am now. I will try to be brave. I will try to be useful. I do not know what else to do." She folded the letter, placed it in the cherrywood box she had carried with her from home, and closed the clasp. Then she lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and tried not to cry. The days that followed settled into a pattern of elegant neglect. Lowen was given a schedule. Meals in her chambers or at the high table if Soren required her presence, which was rare. A lady's maid was assigned to her, a quiet girl named Petra, who spoke only when spoken to and kept her eyes on the floor. The court moved around, a Lowen like water around a stone, acknowledging her title while ignoring her existence. She explored the palace on the third day, partly out of curiosity, and partly because the alternative was sitting in her enormous room and slowly losing her mind. Thornhold was ancient and sprawling, a fortress built in layers over centuries. The lower levels housed the kitchens, the armory, the soldiers' quarters. The middle levels held the great hall, the council chambers, the library. The upper levels were reserved for the royal family and senior nobility. And then there was the infirmary. Elowen found it on the ground floor, tucked behind the kitchens, a long room with high windows and rows of narrow beds. The smell hit her first. Dried herbs and antiseptic tinctures and the faint copper tang of old blood. And it was so familiar, so achingly like home, that her throat closed. A woman stood at the central work table, grinding something with a mortar and pestle. She was perhaps 60, lean and sharp-eyed, with silver hair pulled back in a severe braid. She looked up when Elowen entered, and studied her with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply assessing. "You are the new queen," the woman said. It was not a question. "Elowen," she offered. "I was a healer. In Cairnmore. Before all of this." She gestured vaguely at herself, at the fine clothes that still did not feel like they belonged on her body. "Marin," the woman said. "Head healer, and I know what you were. Your village elder sent a letter, with your things. Said you had the best hands she had trained in 30 years. Marin set down the pestle and crossed her arms. "Good hands are wasted at high table dinners. If you want to make yourself useful, you can start by sorting the dried stores in the back room. Half of them have been mislabeled since my last apprentice left." For the first time since arriving at Thornhold, Elowen smiled. She spent the rest of the afternoon elbow-deep in jars of dried chamomile and valerian root, and for a few hours the weight on her chest lifted enough that she could breathe. It was late evening when she made her way back through the palace corridors. The halls were quiet, most of the household already retired. She passed through the eastern courtyard, a shortcut Petra had shown her, and stopped. Sounds carried across the open space from the far wing. Low, guttural sounds that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Not human. Not entirely animal, either. Something caught between the two, raw and anguished, like a creature trying to tear itself apart from the inside. Elowen moved closer before she could think better of it. Her healer's instincts overrode her common sense, pulling her toward the sound the way they always did. A locked door at the end of a stone corridor, light flickered beneath it. The sounds were louder here, closer, and beneath them she could hear something else. Chains. The unmistakable rattle of heavy iron links. A hand closed around her arm. Elowen spun, her heart slamming against her ribs. Fenric stood behind her, the king's beta, tall and lean, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that gave away absolutely nothing. She had seen him at the wedding, standing 3 paces behind Soren like a shadow with excellent posture. "You should not be here," Fenric said. His voice was quiet, but there was iron beneath it. "Something is in pain," Elowen said, trying to pull her arm free. "I can hear it. Some doors stay closed, Your Grace." He released her arm, but did not move aside. "Allow me to escort you back to your chambers." It was not a request. Elowen looked at the door one last time. The sounds had stopped. The silence that replaced them was somehow worse. She let Fenric walk her back. He said nothing. She said nothing. But when she reached her rooms and turned to close her door, She glanced out the window that overlooked the eastern courtyard. A figure crossed the cobblestones below, emerging from the direction of the locked wing. Tall, unmistakable, even at a distance, Soren. He moved slowly, favoring his left side, and in the pale moonlight she could see it clearly. His shirt was dark with blood. He did not look up. He did not know she was watching. But Eloin stood at that window, long after he disappeared into the far corridor, her pulse hammering, her mind racing, and a single thought repeating itself like a drumbeat she could not silence. What is happening to him? She threw herself into the infirmary. It was the only thing that made sense, the only place where her hands knew what to do, and her mind could quiet itself long enough to function. Maren did not ask questions, which Eloin appreciated more than she could express. The older woman simply handed her tasks each morning: salves to prepare, bandages to roll, patients to assess, and let her work in silence. Within a week, the infirmary staff stopped treating her like a curiosity and started treating her like a colleague. Eloin had always been good with her hands, steady and precise, and the skills she had learned in Cairnmore translated seamlessly. She set a dislocated shoulder for a guard who had fallen during training. She mixed a poultice for a kitchen maid's infected burn that cleared the wound in 3 days instead of the usual 7. She identified a mislabeled jar of foxglove that could have killed someone if it had been administered as the chamomile concentrate. It was marked as impressive, Maren said, holding up the offending jar. That has been sitting on that shelf for 2 months, and no one caught it. Foxglove smells sharper, Eloin said. You can tell if you crush a small amount between your fingers. Maren studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Your village elder was right about your hands. It was the closest thing to a compliment Maren had ever given anyone, and Eloin carried it with her for the rest of the day like a warm stone in her pocket. She wrote to her mother that night. Dear Mother, I found a place here, not a home, not yet, but a place where I am needed. The head healer is terrifying and brilliant, and she reminds me of you in ways that make my chest ache. The palace is still cold, and the king is still a locked door. But the infirmary smells like dried lavender and calendula and possibility. I think I can do some good here even if no one asked me to. 12 days after the wedding, Eloin was summoned to her first council meeting, not because anyone valued her opinion, but because protocol demanded the queen's presence at formal sessions. Petra dressed her in dark green velvet that morning, pinned her hair up with silver combs, and stepped back to assess the result with an expression that suggested Eloin looked passable, but not regal. The council chamber was cavernous. A long oak table dominated the center, surrounded by high-backed chairs occupied by men who were decades older, vastly more powerful, and uniformly uninterested in her arrival. Lowen took her seat at Soren's right hand as directed, and folded her hands in her lap. He was already seated when she arrived. He did not acknowledge her entrance. He did not turn his head. He did not offer the small courtesies that even a stranger might extend to someone sitting beside them. But she was close to him, closer than she had been since the wedding, and this time, she was paying attention. His hand rested on the table beside a stack of reports. She noticed the tremor first, a barely perceptible vibration in his fingers, like a plucked string humming at a frequency almost too low to detect. He pressed his hand flat against the wood, stilling it, but not before she saw. His jaw was tight. His breathing was controlled, deliberately measured, each inhale drawn through the nose and released slowly. The way a person breathes when they are managing something they do not want anyone to notice. And his eyes? She had been too overwhelmed at the wedding to look properly, too shaken by the impact of his gaze. But now, sitting inches from him in the gray council light, she could see what she had missed. His eyes were wrong. Alpha eyes held a glow, a faint luminescence that reflected their wolf's power and vitality. Every alpha she had ever met in Cairnmore, even the weakest among them, carried that inner light like an ember behind their irises. Soren's eyes were flat, dull, the gray of ashes after the fire has gone out. Whatever was supposed to burn behind them had dimmed to almost nothing. Eloan's healer instincts fired like an alarm bell in the back of her mind. Something is very wrong. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Trade disputes, border patrols, grain stores. Soren listened, asked questions, issued decisions. His voice was steady, his authority absolute. No one in that room would have guessed anything was amiss. But Eloan was sitting close enough to see his knuckles go white around the armrest during the second hour. Close enough to see him press his thumb into the center of his palm with enough force to leave a mark. A pain management technique she recognized instantly because she had taught it to patients in Cairnmore. When the meeting ended, the council members filed out in clusters of 2 and 3, murmuring among themselves. Eloan lingered, watching Soren gather his reports. His movements were slower than they should have been. Heavier. "Your Majesty," she said. He stilled but did not look up. I could not help but notice. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Your hand, the tremor. If you are experiencing muscle fatigue, I could prepare a nerve tonic that might help. Valerian, root and skullcap, steeped overnight. It is quite effective." He turned his head then, and the full weight of his gaze settled on her like a physical force. She fought the urge to step back. "You have your duties," he said. "I have mine." The words were not cruel. They were simply closed, a door shutting firmly in her face. He gathered his reports and left the chamber without another word. Eloan stood alone in the empty room, her hands clenched at her sides, frustration and concern warring in her chest. Then she went back to the infirmary and began asking questions. She was careful about it. Oblique. She asked Marin about alpha physiology, in general terms about conditions that could dim an alpha's eye glow, about tremors and pain management, and the particular way Soren held himself, as though his own body was a cage he was trying to keep locked from the inside. Marin answered some questions and deflected others with a precision that told Eloan the older woman knew exactly what she was really asking and had chosen not to address it directly. She asked servants, casually, about the king's habits. Did he eat well? Did he sleep through the night? Had he always been so reserved? Or was this something newer? The answers were vague and nervous. No one wanted to talk about the king. Not to her. Not to anyone. "Dear Mother," she wrote that night, "something is wrong with the king. I can feel it, not just see it, feel it, like a weight pressing against my ribs from the inside. That does not make sense, I know. He is a stranger. We share a roof and a name and nothing else. But there is a wrongness in him, a dimming, and no one will speak of it, and the silence around it is the loudest thing in this palace." 3 weeks after the wedding, the first state dinner arrived. A delegation from the eastern provinces, led by a lord whose name Eloan forgot almost immediately, because the evening was consumed entirely by what happened when Soren offered her his arm. They were standing in the corridor outside the great hall. Guests milled around them, voices bright with anticipation. Soren extended his arm without looking at her, a perfunctory gesture required by protocol. Eloan placed her hand on his forearm. The world shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no thunderclap, no cosmic announcement. It was quieter than that, deeper. A pull in the center of her chest, sudden and fierce, like a hook catching behind her breastbone and yanking. Her breath caught. Her fingers tightened involuntarily on his arm, and she felt heat flood through the point of contact, spreading up her wrist and into her shoulder and down through her stomach, like swallowing sunlight. And his eyes. For one heartbeat, one single, staggering heartbeat, the flat gray of his irises flared. A pulse of gold, bright and burning. The alpha glow blazing to life, like a match struck in a dark room. It was there, then gone. So fast, she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. But she had not imagined it, and neither had he. Soren's head turned sharply, his gaze snapping to hers with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. Something moved behind his eyes. Shock, recognition, and beneath both of those, a flash of raw, unguarded fear. For one suspended moment, they stared at each other in the crowded corridor, and the rest of the world ceased to exist. Then he looked away. His expression shuttered closed. He guided her into the great hall with mechanical precision, seated her at the high table, and did not touch her again for the rest of the evening. He sat beside her for 3 hours and spoke to her twice, both times about inconsequential matters of protocol, and each time his voice was carefully, deliberately neutral, but Eloin had seen his eyes. And she could still feel it now. Hours later, a faint magnetic tug beneath her ribs that pointed toward him like a compass needle finding north. That night, she sat cross-legged on her bed with a fresh piece of parchment and tried to put words to something that defied language. Dear mother, I touched him tonight. Just his arm. Just for a moment. Inside both of us, I think. His eyes changed. For one heartbeat, he looked alive, truly alive. And then it was gone, and he pulled away from me like I had burned him. I do not know what this is. But it is not nothing, mother. Whatever is between us, it is not nothing. She had barely folded the letter and placed it in the cherrywood box when a knock sounded at her door. Eloin opened it to find Fenric standing in the corridor, his face its usual mask of composed neutrality. The king has asked me to convey a message, Fenric said. Going forward, physical contact between yourself and His Majesty will be limited to public appearances where protocol requires it. At all other times, a respectful distance is to be maintained. Eloin stared at him. The words landed like a slap, precise and stinging. May I ask why? She managed. Fenric hesitated. It was barely a pause, a fraction of a second where his composure flickered, but Eloin caught it. Because he is afraid, Fenric said quietly, of what happens if he does not. He turned and walked away before she could respond, his footsteps fading down the long corridor, until the silence swallowed them whole. Eloin stood in her doorway, her heart hammering, Fenric's words echoing through her mind. He is afraid. The Alpha King of Valdren, the man who had ended the Ashen Moor War, who commanded armies, who ruled with an iron authority that made grown men lower their eyes, was afraid of her, of touching her, of what happened when he did. She closed the door slowly, pressed her back against the cold wood, and tried to steady her breathing. Whatever had flared between them, in that corridor, was not her imagination. It was real enough to frighten a king into issuing a formal decree to keep her at arm's length. And that raised a question far more unsettling than any she had asked before. What was he hiding that her touch could threaten? Sorin's decree held for exactly 11 days. 11 days of careful, measured distance. 11 days of sitting at opposite ends of the high table, of walking 3 paces apart through palace corridors, of exchanging words only when court protocol demanded it. Eloin obeyed. She had no choice. But obedience did not stop her from noticing things. On the 4th day, a book appeared on her work table in the infirmary. A treatise on alpine medicinal herbs, Volume 3, leather-bound and clearly expensive, with annotations in the margins from someone who had actually used the remedies described. Eloin turned the book over in her hands, confused. Who left this? She asked Marin. The older woman glanced up from her work, looked at the book, and returned her attention to the poultice she was mixing. It was delivered this morning. No note. Eloin opened the cover. The annotations were written in a sharp, angular hand she did not recognize, but Marin's mouth had twitched, just slightly, in a way that suggested she knew exactly where the book had come from. On the 6th day, a carpenter arrived to fix the draft in the infirmary's back window, a problem Eloin had mentioned once, in passing to Petra. The repair had been authorized by the king's office. On the 8th day, Marin told her, almost offhandedly, that the crown had approved an expanded budget for medicinal supplies, specifically the alpine herbs that Eloin had been requesting for weeks. He is not indifferent, Eloin realized. He is trying to be. The distinction mattered more than it should have. She wrote that night with steadier hands than she had managed in days. Dear Mother, he fixed my window. I know that sounds absurd as a reason to feel hopeful. But you have to understand, this is a man who rules an entire kingdom, and he noticed a draft in the infirmary. He noticed, and he did something about it. And he did not tell me he had done it because then he would have to acknowledge that he was thinking about me. I should not read so much into a window repair. But I am reading into it and I cannot stop. On the 11th night, the sounds returned. Eloin had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the palace after dark, the changing of the guard at the 10th bell, the kitchen staff finishing their cleaning shortly after, the deep silence that settled over Thornhold like a held breath once the fires were banked and the corridors emptied. But beneath that silence, if she strained to listen from her window overlooking the eastern courtyard, she could hear it, the locked wing. That terrible gutted sound of something caught between forms, between states of being, fighting a battle it was losing. Tonight it was worse. The sounds carried farther than before, raw and desperate, and beneath them she heard something new. A crash, then another, the sound of something heavy hitting stone again and again, with a rhythm that spoke of blind, frantic struggle. Blowen pulled on her robe and was out the door before her better judgment could intervene. The corridors were empty. The guards who normally patrolled the eastern wing were conspicuously absent, reassigned perhaps, or told to stay away. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold stone as she moved through the shadows. She knew she should not be doing this. Fenric had made that abundantly clear. Some doors stay closed. But Fenric was not a healer. He had not spent his life training his ears to find suffering and his hands to soothe it. And the sounds coming from behind that door were the sounds of a creature being torn apart. The door was ajar. Not open, exactly, but not fully closed, as though whoever had locked it last had been in too great a hurry to check the latch. Light spilled through the gap, flickering and unsteady, and with it came the smell, blood, old stone. And something else, something acrid and wrong, that coated the back of her throat like smoke from a fire that burned too hot. Eloin pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a vault, low-ceilinged and circular, with thick stone walls and iron rings bolted into the floor. Chains ran from the rings to the center of the room. Heavy chains, made for restraining something far larger and stronger than any human. And at the center of those chains, on his knees, was Soren. The breath left her body. He was shirtless, his wrists bound in iron restraints. The chains pulled taut as his body convulsed. But it was not the chains that stopped her heart. It was what was happening to his skin. Dark lines spread across his torso, like cracks in fractured glass, branching and multiplying with each passing second. Black veins, raised and pulsing, radiating outward from a point just below his left collarbone. The veins moved. They crawled beneath his skin with a sickening organic intelligence, spreading toward his throat, down his arms, across his ribs. Where they passed, the flesh beneath went gray and bloodless, as though the life was being drained from it 1 inch at a time. His wolf was trying to emerge. She could see it in the way his spine arched, the way his muscles seized and rippled, the way his eyes flickered between flat gray and a desperate drowning gold. But the shift would not complete. His body was caught between forms, human bones, straining against something that wanted to reshape them, and the curse was fighting it at every stage. Every attempt to shift sent the dark veins surging further, faster, and the sound that tore from his throat was not a howl or a scream, but something far worse. It was the sound of an animal giving up. Eloin moved without thinking. She crossed the room in 4 strides, dropped to her knees in front of him, and pressed both hands flat against his chest. The heat of his skin was shocking, feverish, and wrong, and beneath her palms she could feel the dark veins writhing like living things. "I am here," she said. She did not know why those were the words that came. They were not medical. They were not strategic. They were the simplest, truest thing she could offer. The effect was immediate. The veins beneath her hands recoiled. Not slowly, not gradually, but like something burned. Like her touch was a brand pressed against the curse's skin. The black lines retreated from her fingers, pulling back toward the center of his chest, and wherever they withdrew, healthy color flooded back into his flesh. His wolf's desperate, surging, calmed. His breathing, which had been ragged and arrhythmic, began to steady. The flickering in his eyes slowed, and the gold strengthened, not flickering now, but holding, burning with a warmth that made her own wolf stir beneath her skin. For the first time in her life, Soren's head dropped forward. His forehead came to rest against her shoulder, and his weight settled against her as the tension drained from his body. In one long, shuddering exhale, the chains went slack, his hands unclenched, and in the silence that followed, all she could hear was his breathing and hers, falling slowly into the same rhythm, as though their lungs had decided without permission to share the same air. She did not know how long they stayed like that. Minutes, maybe longer. His skin cooled beneath her hands. The dark veins faded to faint shadows, then to nothing. She could feel his heart beat against her palm, strong and steady now, and something in her own chest answered it with a pulse so deep and fierce it frightened her. When she finally looked up, Fenric was standing in the doorway. His face was unreadable, but his hands were shaking. "How long has this been happening?" Elowen asked, her voice barely a whisper. Fenric did not answer. He looked at Soren, unconscious against Elowen's shoulder, and then back at her, and something in his expression shifted from guarded to something close to grief. That night, after Fenric and a guard had carried Soren back to his chambers and Elowen had been escorted to her own rooms, she sat on the edge of her bed and wrote with ink-stained fingers that would not stop trembling. "Dear Mother, I know what is killing him now. I saw it with my own eyes. It lives beneath his skin like a second heartbeat, dark and patient, and it is eating him alive. And when I touched him, it ran from me. I do not understand why. I do not understand any of this, but I know one thing with a certainty that terrifies me. I am not going to let him die. I do not care what it costs. I am not going to let him die." Soren woke the next morning with no memory of the previous night's episode. That was normal, Fenric told her. The episodes were like storms. They passed through him and left wreckage, but no recollection. What was not normal was waking to discover that the Queen, his political wife, the woman he had specifically ordered to be kept at a distance, had walked into his most closely guarded secret and put her hands on the curse that was killing him. Fenric delivered the news at dawn. Elowen was not there to witness it, but she could imagine the conversation perfectly because she could hear the aftermath from 2 corridors away. A door slamming hard enough to shake dust from the rafters, raised voices, Soren's deep and furious, Fenric's measured and calm. Then silence, which was somehow worse. The summons came within the hour. Elowen was escorted to the king's private study by a guard who looked like he would rather be walking into actual battle. The study was small and book-lined, heavy curtains drawn against the morning light. Soren stood behind his desk, his hands braced against the surface, his head bowed. He did not look at her when she entered. Fenric stood to one side, his posture that of a man prepared to intervene. "You had no right," Soren said. His voice was low and controlled, but she could hear what simmered beneath it. Not anger, precisely. Something closer to humiliation. "I heard someone in pain," Elowen replied. I responded, "That is what healers do. You are not my healer." "No, I am your wife, and you are dying on the floor of a room you chain yourself to every night like an animal." Should I have walked away? His head came up. His gray eyes locked onto hers, and in them she saw everything he was trying to hide. The shame, the exhaustion. the slow, grinding erosion of a man who had been fighting a losing battle in secret for so long. He had forgotten what it felt like to stand on solid ground. Yes, he said, you should have walked away. The word landed like a stone. Lowen did not flinch. Well, she said, I did not, and I will not. So you might as well tell me the truth. He stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then the fight went out of him. She watched it happen, the way his shoulders dropped, the way his hands released their grip on the desk, the way his jaw unclenched, and it was like watching a wall collapse from the inside. Sit down, he said quietly. She sat. And he told her everything. The Ashenmoor War had been over for 14 months. A border conflict that should have been resolved through diplomacy but escalated into something far bloodier. The enemy Alpha, a man named Dragon Morvain, had led a separatist faction that rejected the crown's authority over the Eastern Territories. Months of negotiations had failed. Villages burned. Civilians died. Soren had been left with no choice but to march. The battle at Ashenmoor Pass was the last engagement, Soren said, his voice stripped of inflection, recounting facts like a man reading a casualty report. Dragon's forces were outnumbered, and they knew it. He challenged me directly, a single combat for the outcome of the war. He paused. I accepted. Eloin watched his face, saw the way his gaze went distant, fixed on a memory he could not escape. I killed him, Soren continued. But before he fell, his mother stepped forward from the tree line. Vessa Morvain. She cut her own palm and pressed it to my skin, and spoke words in a language I did not understand. His hand moved unconsciously to the spot below his left collarbone, where Eloin had seen the dark veins originate. The curse entered through the wound. I felt it immediately like ice water in my veins. She told me what it would do. She said it would eat my wolf from the inside out. That every night the fading would grow, and when the wolf finally died, I would follow. And she was right, Eloin said. It was not a question. 14 months, Fenric said, from his position by the wall. In the beginning, the episodes came once a month, then every 2 weeks. Now they come every few nights, sometimes consecutive. His voice was carefully neutral, but Eloin could hear the strain beneath it. Maren has tried everything. Every remedy, every herb, every known countermeasure to blood magic. Nothing has worked. Until you, Soren said, and his gaze found hers again. Last night, Fenric says the curse retreated when you touched me. He says my wolf stabilized within seconds. He looks like a man trying to hold something at arm's length that kept pulling closer. How? I do not know, Eloin said honestly. I know, Maren said from the doorway. None of them had heard her approach, which was either a testament to the old healer's quiet feat or to how thoroughly consumed they had all been by the conversation. Maren entered without waiting for permission, which told Eloin everything she needed to know about the healers standing in this household. She looked at Soren, then at Eloin, then back at Soren. I need to run some tests, Maren said. On the Queen's blood, her scent markers, her pheromonal signature. I have a theory, but I will need evidence before I share it. What kind of theory? Soren asked. The kind that requires evidence? Maren repeated, unmoved. In the meantime, I would recommend that the Queen be present during the King's episodes. If her touch can suppress the curse, even temporarily, it buys us time to find a permanent solution. The room went quiet. Eloin could feel Soren's resistance from across the desk, the way his whole body tightened against the suggestion. But she could also see what Fenric saw, what Maren saw, the shadows beneath his eyes. The barely perceptible tremor in his hands, the fading light in his irises that dimmed a little more each day. I will do it, Eloin said before he could refuse. Soren's jaw clenched. This is not your burden. No, she agreed. It is my choice. He looked at her then, with an expression she could not read, something raw and complicated, and almost painful, as though her words had reached a part of him he had been keeping locked away. That night, Eloin sat in a chair beside the King's bed and watched him sleep, not the vault this time. Marin had insisted that rest between episodes was as important as managing the episodes themselves, and Fenric had quietly arranged for a chair and a blanket to be placed in the king's chambers. The arrangement was clinical, supervised, strictly functional. But sitting in the dark, listening to his breathing, feeling the faint pull in her chest that tugged toward him like a tide responding to the moon. Nothing about it felt clinical. His sleep was restless. He shifted, turned, muttered words she could not catch. At some point past midnight, his breathing sharpened, and the first dark veins flickered beneath the skin of his neck. Eloan reached out and took his hand. The veins receded. His breathing smoothed, his fingers, slack in sleep, closed around hers, with a grip that was gentle but certain, as though some part of him recognized her, even in unconsciousness. She held his hand until dawn, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, and tried not to think about what it meant, that her touch could quiet something that had resisted every remedy known to the kingdom's finest healers. Dear mother, I held his hand tonight while he slept. He does not know that I was shaking. He does not know that every time I touch him, something inside me answers, like a bell struck in a silent room. I am terrified. Not of the curse, not of the darkness I saw moving under his skin, but of this feeling, this pull, because I think I know what it is, and if I am right, then nothing about this arrangement is what either of us believed it to be. She tucked the letter into the cherrywood box beside the others and pressed the clasp shut. 2 days later, Marin called her into the back room of the infirmary and closed the door. I have my results, the old healer said. Her face was grave. Your pheromonal signature carries an extremely rare calming compound, one that specifically targets the alpha bonding receptors in a shifter's nervous system. It is powerful, and it explains why his wolf responds to your presence. Eloan nodded slowly. But that is not what truly suppresses the curse, is it? Marin held her gaze, her expression unreadable. No, she said quietly. The calming effect alone would slow the curse, perhaps, but not reverse it. Not the way I saw it retreat from your touch. She paused. There is only one force strong enough to override blood magic at the cellular level. One thing that can reach an alpha's wolf when nothing else can. Eloan's heart was hammering. She already knew. She had known, somewhere beneath her ribs, since the moment she touched his arm at the state dinner and watched his eyes catch fire. A fated bond, Marin said. The words settled over the room like a sentence. Eloan did not tell him. She stood in the infirmary after Marin's revelation and made a decision that felt like swallowing glass. She would not tell Soren about the bond. The logic was simple, even if it cut her to follow it. He had married her for political reasons. A treaty, an alliance, a signature on a document that traded her life for her people's safety. If she told him about the bond, everything would change, and not in the ways she wanted. He would feel obligated, trapped, chained to her by forces neither of them had chosen, on top of a marriage neither of them had wanted. The bond would become another cage, and she had seen what cages did to him. She had seen him chained in that vault, so she said nothing. She continued to sit with him at night. She held his hand when the curse surged. She watched the dark veins retreat at her touch, and felt the pull in her chest grow stronger with each passing day, and she kept her mouth shut, and her face composed, and told herself that this was enough. Helping him was enough. Saving him was enough. She did not need him to love her. She did not need him to know. But keeping the secret cost her in ways she had not anticipated. The bond, unacknowledged and incomplete, did not care about her reasons. Constantly, relentlessly, a magnetic force beneath her ribs that oriented her toward him every moment of every day. She knew where he was in the palace without being told. She could feel his moods shift like weather patterns, a tightening in her chest when he was stressed, a warmth when he was calm, a sharp ache when he was in pain, and the nights were their own particular torture. She sat beside his bed and held his hand and listened to him breathe and wanted to climb into that bed beside him. Wanted to press herself against his back and wrap her arms around him and pour every ounce of warmth she possessed into the cold places the curse had carved inside him. But she did not. She sat in her chair and held his hand and ached. The arrangement lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of nightly vigils and careful distance, and a connection that deepened despite every effort to contain it. He began to talk to her during the quiet hours before sleep took him. Not about the curse, not about politics, but about small things. The horse he had trained as a boy, the constellation his mother had taught him to find when he was afraid of the dark. The way the mountain passes looked at dawn after the first snowfall, when the light turned the ice into something that burned like fire, and she talked back. About Cairn Moor, about the healer who had raised her. About the way the river behind her village sounded at night, a constant rushing lullaby that she still heard sometimes in her sleep. About her mother, the one she had never met, the one she wrote letters to, because the alternative was admitting that she had no one to talk to at all. "You write to her?" he asked one night, his voice rough with approaching sleep. "Every night," Eloan admitted. "It helps. Putting words on paper, like if I write it down it becomes real. The things I feel, the things I notice. Otherwise it all just stays inside me and I cannot breathe." He was quiet for a long time. She thought he had fallen asleep until he spoke again, barely audible. "What do you write about?" "Everything," she thought. "You. I write about you. Just my day," she said instead. "The infirmary. The patients. Whatever is on my mind." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement, and then his breathing deepened, and he was gone. She sat holding his hand in the dark, her heart a fist behind her ribs, and knew with terrible clarity that she was in love with him. Completely and irreversibly, and with a depth that would destroy her if she let it. The following Tuesday, everything broke. She learned later what had prompted it. Soren had woken that morning with Eloin's name on his lips, and a pull in his chest so violent it had driven him to his knees. He had gone to Maren demanding answers, demanding to know why his wolf surged toward a woman who was merely sitting in a chair across the room, why her scent had become the only thing that quieted the fading, why the separation he enforced during the days felt like holding his breath underwater. Maren, who had been waiting weeks for exactly this conversation, had told him the truth. Eloan was in the infirmary preparing a sedative compound for a patient with chronic joint pain when she heard voices from the back room. Maren's voice, low and urgent, and another voice she recognized instantly, though she had never heard it sound so strained. Soren. She did not mean to eavesdrop. She told herself that as she moved closer to the partially open door, her hands still stained with calendula oil, her heart already beginning to race. She told herself she had every right to be in the infirmary, that it was coincidence, that she was simply passing through. "The bond is not a theory anymore," Maren was saying. "The blood work confirms it. Her markers and yours are complementary at the molecular level. This is a fated pairing, Your Majesty, one of the strongest I have ever documented." Silence. Eloan pressed her back against the wall and tried to breathe. "How long has she known?" Soren asked. His voice was dangerously quiet. "I told her 2 weeks ago," Maren said. "She asked me not to tell you." Another silence, longer and heavier than the first. "She asked you not to tell me," Soren repeated, and each word was wrapped in something that sounded like betrayal. Eloan's stomach dropped to the floor. She heard the scrape of a chair, heard footsteps crossing the room. She did not run. There was nowhere to go, and she was done hiding. Soren emerged from the back room and found her standing in the corridor with calendula on her hands and guilt written across her face. He looked at her, and she watched the understanding land. She had heard everything. He knew she had heard everything. "You knew," he said. "Yes, you knew, and you said nothing." "I did not want you to feel trapped," Eloan said, her voice cracking at the edges. "You married me for a treaty. You did not choose me. I was not going to add another chain to a man who already has too many." Something moved across his face, fast and devastating, and gone before she could name it. Another chain, he repeated, like the words had a taste he could not bear. He looked at her for what felt like an eternity, then he shut down. She watched it happen in real time, watched the vulnerability drain from his expression like water from a broken vessel, replaced by the cold, controlled mask he wore for the rest of the world. "The arrangement is over," he said. "Your Majesty, please. You will return to the Queen's chambers. You will no longer attend my rooms at night. If you stop, the curse will. That is my concern, not yours." "It is my concern," Eloin said, her voice rising, "because if you die, I die. That is what a fated bond means. You know that." He flinched. A full-body flinch that he could not hide, and for one raw, unguarded second, she saw the devastation in his eyes. Then it was gone. "Which is precisely why you need to be as far from me as possible," he said, his voice rough and final. "The bond is incomplete. It can still be broken. If we sever contact now, you will survive." "And you?" she whispered. He did not answer. He turned and walked past her, and she smelled his scent as he passed. Cedar and iron and something warm underneath that she had come to associate with safety, and the pull in her chest screamed. "Do not follow me," he said without looking back. "That is an order." The door closed behind him. Eloin stood in the corridor and pressed her fist against her sternum and tried to breathe through the pain. He was choosing to die. He was choosing to die rather than let the bond chain her to him. And she could not make him see that it was not a chain. It had never been a chain. The separation was immediate and absolute. Fenric, loyal to his king, enforced it with quiet efficiency. Eloin was gently but firmly redirected. Whenever she moved toward the king's wing, her access to the eastern corridor was revoked. Soren stopped attending meals where she was present, stopped appearing in the corridors she walked, stopped existing in her world, entirely except as an absence shaped exactly like him. The first 3 days were bearable. The fourth was not. The pull became a constant, gnawing ache that settled into her bones and refused to leave. Headaches arrived on the 5th day, blinding and relentless, driving her to work with the curtains drawn and her teeth gritted against the pain. Her appetite vanished. Her sleep, fractured into restless hours, punctuated by dreams of dark veins and flat gray eyes, and a man kneeling in chains who would not let her help him. Through Marin, she learned that Soren was deteriorating. The episodes had escalated. 2 in one night on the 6th day, 3 on the 7th. Fenric was sleeping outside the vault door because the guards could no longer restrain the king during the worst of it. The dark veins were spreading faster, reaching further, taking longer to recede. "He is killing himself," Eloin said to Marin. "He is trying to protect you," Marin replied. "By dying." Marin did not argue the point. Eloin paced the length of the infirmary, her hands trembling, her vision blurring at the edges. "There has to be something I can do, something that does not require his permission." Marin watched her pace, her expression caught between sympathy and clinical assessment. "You look terrible," the healer observed. "Thank you. I mean it. Sit down. Let me look at you." Eloin sat. Marin checked her pulse, examined her eyes, pressed her fingers to the glands beneath her jaw. Her expression grew more serious with each observation. "The bond is pulling you apart," Marin said, her voice careful and precise. "An incomplete fated bond. Under this kind of strain, separation, proximity to a curse, the mate's body in decline, your system is trying to reach him. When it cannot, it turns inward. Your body is consuming itself, trying to bridge a gap it was never designed to sustain." "How long?" Eloin asked, Marin's mouth pressed into a thin line. "At this rate, both of you. Weeks, maybe less." The room tilted. Eloin gripped the edge of the examination table and forced the world to stay level. "Then I need to reach him. He has forbidden it. Then I need to reach him without his permission." Marin watched her pace, then stopped and turned to face her fully, something shifting behind her eyes. Then the old healer stood and walked to the door. She checked the corridor in both directions before closing it firmly and turning back to Elowin. "There is a way," Marin said, "but it is dangerous, and if it fails, the consequences will be severe, for both of you." Elowin met her gaze. "Tell me." Marin's plan was simple, in concept and terrifying in execution. "The bond between you is incomplete," the old healer explained, her voice low and precise. "It formed naturally, which means it is waiting for both parties to accept it. Right now, it exists as a bridge half-built, strong enough to pull you toward each other, but not strong enough to carry anything across." She paused. "If you complete the bond, your wolf gains direct access to his. You could reach past the curse and anchor his wolf from the inside. Give it something to hold on to, while the fading tries to drag it under." "And if I fail?" Elowen asked. "If his wolf is already too far gone, or if the curse resists the bond, the fading could pull you in with him. You would share his death instead of preventing it." Elowen stared at the old healer and waited for the fear to arrive. It did not. What arrived instead was a clarity so absolute, it felt like stepping out of fog into open air. "How do I complete it?" she asked. Marin studied her face, searching for doubt. She must not have found any, because she answered. "Physical contact, sustained, deliberate, with full acceptance of the bond on your end. Press your hand to the mark where the curse entered him, below his left collarbone. Open yourself to the bond completely. Hold nothing back. If the bond is strong enough, and if he accepts it even unconsciously, it will complete. And if he does not accept it, then nothing happens, and you will have risked everything for nothing." Elowen nodded slowly. "When?" "Tonight," Marin said. "His episodes are coming closer together. Fenric sent word an hour ago. The king collapsed during his evening briefing. They moved him to the vault. This may be the last night he has the strength to survive one." Elowen returned to her chambers and sat on the edge of her bed. The cherrywood box sat on the nightstand, where it always sat, the clasp worn smooth from years of opening and closing. She pulled out a fresh piece of parchment. Her hands were steady. She was not afraid. Or perhaps she was afraid and the love was simply louder. "Dear Mother, if I do not survive what I am about to do, I need you to know that I chose it. He will think I was foolish. He will think I threw my life away for a man who never wanted me, but that is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I have loved him since the night he carried a stable boy 2 miles through the rain to the infirmary, because no one else would go out in the storm. The whole truth is that I felt the bond the first time I touched him, and I never told him, because I did not want him to feel trapped. He married me out of duty. I will not make him love me out of obligation, but I can choose to save him. And he is worth choosing, Mother. Even if he never knows it, he is worth choosing." She placed the letter in the box with all the others and closed the clasp. She set the box on the shelf in the reading room, where she often spent her afternoons tucked between 2 volumes of herbal compendiums. If something happened to her, someone would find it eventually, or no one would. It did not matter. The letters had never been for anyone but herself, and a woman who had been dead for 20 years. The corridors were empty at this hour. The palace slept, and Elowen moved through it like a ghost, barefoot on the cold stone. Her heart beat, the only sound in the world. She reached the eastern wing and found the door to the vault corridor unguarded. Fenric had pulled the sentries back, probably to protect them. She could hear Soren from the end of the hallway. The sounds were worse than anything she had heard before, raw and splintering, like something fundamental was coming apart at the seams. Fenric stepped out of the shadows before she reached the door. His face was haggard, exhaustion carved into every line. "You cannot be here," he said, but his voice held no conviction. "Fenric," she met his eyes. "You know what is happening to him. You know he will not survive another night like this?" The beta looked at the vault door. Something crashed against it from the inside, and the heavy oak shuddered in its frame. When he looked back at Elowen, the mask was gone. What remained was a man watching his closest friend die and running out of reasons to follow orders that were killing him. Maren told me what you intend to do, Fenric said. She told me the risks. Yes. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. Save him, he said quietly. Please. Aloan pushed the door open. The vault was worse than the first time. The chains that had held Soren were shattered, iron links scattered across the floor like shattered glass. The torches on the walls guttered and dimmed, their light fighting against a darkness that seemed to press inward from the edges of the room. Soren was on his knees at the center, his body rigid, his head thrown back. The dark veins had spread further than she had ever seen them, covering his arms, his chest, his neck, crawling up toward his jaw like fingers, reaching for his throat. His eyes were open, but they were not his eyes. They were black, flat and empty, and devoid of anything. She recognized the curse had almost won. Eloan crossed the room and dropped to her knees in front of him. Soren, she said, I am here. I know you told me to stay away. I know you gave me an order. I am disobeying it. She reached for him. I choose you, she said, not because of a bond, not because of obligation, because you carried a boy through the rain when no one was watching, because you fixed my window without telling me, because you asked about my letters and remembered every word I said in the dark, because you are worth choosing, and I am choosing you. Right now, do you hear me? I am choosing you. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, directly over the point below his left collarbone where the curse had entered him, and she opened herself to the bond completely. The bond ignited. There was no other word for it. It blazed through her like a struck match, dropped into dry timber, white hot and absolute, flooding through every nerve and vein and hollow space inside her until she could not tell where she ended and he began. She felt his wolf, distant and fading, a guttering flame in a vast darkness, and she reached for it with everything she had. The curse fought back. The dark veins surged toward her hand, wrapping around her wrist, crawling up her forearm, and the cold that came with them was beyond anything she had experienced. Not the cold of winter or ice or stone. The cold of absence, of endings, of a world where nothing lived and nothing grew, and everything that had ever mattered was already ash. Eloan did not let go. The veins climbed her arm, past her elbow, past her shoulder. She felt the cold reach her chest and wrap around her heart, and for one terrible crystalline moment, she understood what Soren had been enduring every night since the war. The weight of it, the loneliness of it, the way it whispered that resistance was pointless, that the darkness was patient, that eventually everything surrendered. No, she said. The word came out small and human and stubborn in the face of something vast and ancient and indifferent. She poured herself into the bond, every memory, every feeling, every letter she had ever written to a mother she had never known. The warmth of Cairnmore, the smell of dried lavender, the sound of the river at night, the first time she had seen Soren's eyes flare gold and known, with a certainty that preceded logic, that he was hers. The bond answered. It roared through both of them like a river breaking through a dam, and suddenly she was not alone. She felt Soren's wolf rise to meet hers, felt the two of them locked together, like hands clasping in the dark, and the combined force of the bond slammed into the curse, with an impact that shook the foundations of the vault. The dark veins shattered. They did not retreat this time, did not slink back to regroup. They broke apart like glass struck with a hammer, fragmenting into wisps of black smoke that dissolved into the air and were gone. The torches flared back to full brightness. The oppressive darkness lifted, and Soren's eyes, when they opened, were gold. Pure, blazing, unbroken gold, brighter than she had ever seen them. He looked at her. She looked at him. The bond hummed between them, warm and golden and complete, and Eloan felt it settle into her chest like a second heartbeat. Then her vision grayed at the edges, and the cold that the curse had poured into her body claimed its due, and she collapsed forward into his arms. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was Soren's voice, raw and desperate and breaking. Eloan. No, stay with me. Please stay with me." Soren held her and felt the world end. She was breathing, barely. Her skin was ice cold, and dark shadows moved faintly beneath the surface of her arms, where the curse had climbed. She had taken it into herself. She had opened the bond and poured herself into it, and the curse had used that opening to pour itself into her. He gathered her against his chest, cradling her head, and the sound that escaped his throat was not a word. It was the sound of an alpha whose mate was dying in his arms, and it echoed off the vault walls like something that would never stop. Fenric appeared in the doorway. Maren was behind him, already moving, her healer's bag in her hands. The old woman knelt beside Aloin and pressed her fingers to the pulse point beneath her jaw. "She is alive," Maren said, "but the curse transferred partially. It is in her system now, dormant for the moment, but it will not stay dormant." "Can you remove it?" Soren demanded. His voice was shattered. "Not with medicine," Maren said. "This is blood magic. It responds to blood and bond, not herbs." She looked at him, and her gaze was the steadiest thing in the room. "The bond is complete. I can feel it, which means you have access to her now, the same way she had access to you." "What does that mean?" "It means you can reach her, the way she reached you. Through the bond, but not here." Maren touched Eloin's forehead gently. "She is somewhere inside, fighting this. If you want to bring her back, you go in after her." They moved Eloin to the king's chambers. Soren carried her himself, refusing to let anyone else touch her, and laid her on the bed with a gentleness that made Fenric look away. Her breathing was shallow. The dark shadows beneath her skin had not spread, but they had not receded either. She looked small in that enormous bed, and the wrongness of her lying still and cold in a place that should have been warm and safe was more than Soren could bear. "How?" he asked Maren. "Lie beside her. Close your eyes and follow the bond inward. It will take you where she is." He hesitated, and Maren saw it. "Your Majesty, that woman walked into a room full of dark magic and took your death into her own body because she loved you. The least you can do is go get her." Soren lay down beside Eloin and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, and the bond between them, so warm and alive minutes ago, felt thin and stretched, like a rope being pulled taut over a great distance. He closed his eyes and followed it. The world dissolved. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in a place he did not recognize. Not the vault, not the palace, not any landscape he had ever walked. A vast, empty plain, stretched in every direction beneath a sky that held no stars. The ground was ash-gray and soft underfoot, and the air smelled of nothing at all. No wind, no sound, no life. Just absence, vast and patient, and final. And ahead of him, at the edge of the emptiness, Eloin stood with her arms outstretched, her palms pressed against a wall of darkness that rippled and surged like a living thing. The curse. He could see it now for what it truly was. Not veins beneath skin, not smoke or shadow, but a presence, a hunger. It pressed against Eloin's hands, testing her resistance, probing for weakness, and she held it back through sheer force of will, her bare feet sliding in the ash, her body trembling with effort. Behind her, curled on the gray ground, was a wolf. Small and dim, its fur matted, its breathing labored. His wolf, the piece of his soul that the curse had been slowly devouring since Ashen Moor. Eloin was shielding it with her body. "Eloin," he called. She did not turn, could not turn. The moment she moved, the darkness would surge past her and reach the wolf, and whatever remained of it would be consumed. So Soren went to her. He crossed the distance in strides that felt like miles. And when he reached her, he pressed his hands against the wall of darkness beside hers. The curse recognized him. He felt it recoil, then surge with renewed hunger, and suddenly he understood what it wanted. Not his wolf, not Eloin, his guilt, his grief, his belief, buried so deep he had never spoken it aloud, that the war had made him something unforgivable. The darkness shifted, and Dragon Morvain stood before him. Not the fallen enemy Alpha from Ashenmoor Pass, but a figure woven from the curse's substance, shaped from Soren's own memory and given a mouthful of words that were not dragons at all. They were Soren's. His own doubts, his own accusations, his own midnight convictions, spoken back to him in a dead man's voice. "You did not have to march on us," the figure said. "You chose blood because it was faster." "That is not true," Soren said. But the words felt hollow, because part of him, the part the curse had been feeding on for over a year, believed it was. "You are a killer," the figure continued. "You wore a crown and called it duty, but you are a killer, and nothing you build will ever change what you destroyed." Soren's hands faltered against the darkness. The wall pushed forward an inch. "He is lying!" Aloin's voice strained and breathless but certain. "That is not Dragon speaking. That is you. That is every terrible thing you have told yourself in the dark when no one was listening." Soren looked at her. She was shaking with effort, sweat on her brow, her arms trembling, but her eyes were clear and fierce, and utterly unafraid. "I know what it feels like," she said, "to carry a story about yourself that is not true. I carried one my whole life. That I was not enough. That my parents left because I was not worth staying for. That I needed to earn every scrap of love by being useful, by being small, by taking up as little room as possible." Her voice cracked, but she did not stop. It was a lie, a comfortable, familiar, terrible lie, and I believed it, because believing it was easier than believing I deserved more. She turned her head to look at him fully, and the love in her eyes was so naked, so unguarded, it stole his breath. "You went to war because people were dying and you were the only one with the power to stop it. You tried to negotiate. You offered peace. Dragon refused. The blood that followed is a tragedy, not a verdict. It does not define you. It does not disqualify you from living, from being loved, from deserving a life that is more than penance." The figure of Dragon flickered, its edges blurring. "Let it go," Aloin whispered. "Not the memory, not the grief, those are yours to carry. But the punishment, the belief that you deserve to be destroyed for surviving, let that go, please. For both of us." Soren felt something break inside his chest. Not the sharp, destructive breaking of bone, but the slow, necessary breaking of a dam that had held too long. The grief rushed through him. 14 months of guilt and shame and sleepless nights and chains and darkness. And he did not fight it. He let it come. He let it wash over him and through him and out of him, and as it passed, the darkness before them began to thin. The figure of Dragon dissolved. The wall of shadow fragmented, splitting apart into wisps that drifted upward into the starless sky, and vanished. The vast, empty plain began to change. Color bled back into the ground. Slowly, then all at once. Ash became earth. Silence became wind. And behind them, the wolf stirred. It lifted its head. Its eyes, dim and fading moments ago, blazed gold. It rose, shook itself, and when it raised its muzzle and howled, the sound was not grief or pain, but something fierce and defiant and alive. Soren turned to Aloin. She was on her knees, exhausted, her arms finally lowered. He dropped beside her, gathered her into his arms, and held her so tightly, he was not sure either of them could breathe. "I read your letters," he said against her hair. "All of them." She stiffened. The box fell. "Aloin, I read every word you ever wrote to your mother, and I need you to know something." He pulled back just enough to see her face. Her eyes were wide and raw and terrified in a way that had nothing to do with curses or darkness. "You said you did not want me to feel trapped," he continued, his voice rough. "You said you would not make me love you out of obligation. But you need to hear this. The bond did not make me love you. You did. The woman who sorted my herbalist shelves and told me about river sounds and held my hand in the dark without asking for anything in return. The bond confirmed what I already felt. It did not create it. Eloan's face crumbled. She pressed her forehead against his chest, and the sob that escaped her was the sound of someone putting down a weight they had carried for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright without it. "I'd choose you too," Soren said. "Not because of duty, not because of a treaty, because you are worth choosing. You have always been worth choosing." The wolf inside him howled, full-throated and triumphant, and Eloan's wolf answered, for the first time a sound she had never made before in her life, rising from somewhere, deep and primal and joyful. The bond flared between them, bright and golden and permanent, and the empty plain dissolved, and they woke together in the warm darkness of his chambers, tangled in each other's arms, alive and whole, and finally. The curse did not leave cleanly. Eloan spent 3 days in bed, recovering from the residual cold that had poured into her body, and Soren did not leave her side for a single one of them. He slept in the chair beside the bed, which was absurd, given that the bed was the size of a small country and could have accommodated 6 people comfortably. But Eloan suspected he stayed in the chair because it kept him close enough to hold her hand while she slept, without the risk of jostling her. On the 4th day she woke to find a letter on the pillow beside her. Not parchment from the palace stores, but a piece of heavy cream paper, folded once, with her name written on the front in a sharp, angular hand she now recognized. The same hand that had annotated the herbal treatise weeks ago. "Dear Eloan, I have never written a letter like this before. I do not know how they work. You seem to find it useful, putting words on paper, and I have things to say that I cannot seem to manage out loud, so I am trying it your way. Here is what I want you to know. You are not invisible. You have never been invisible. From the moment you walked into my council chamber smelling of lavender and looking at me like I was a patient instead of a king. I saw you. I saw you when you caught the mislabeled foxglove. I saw you when you told Marin about the river in Cairnmore, and your whole face changed. I saw you every single day that I pretended I did not, and the pretending was the hardest thing I have done, and I have fought a war. You told your mother I was worth choosing. You were wrong about one thing. You said even if I never knew it. I know it now, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it too. Yours, Soren." Eloan pressed the letter against her chest and cried. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had learned to shed in silence over a lifetime of being overlooked, but the full, graceless, shaking kind that left her blotchy and breathless and utterly undone. Soren appeared in the doorway. His eyes were gold, fully and permanently gold, and they softened when they found her. "Too much?" he asked. She laughed through her tears. "Not enough. Come here." He crossed the room, sat on the edge of the bed, and she pulled him down beside her, pressing her face into his chest, breathing him in. Cedar and iron and something warm that she now understood was the bond itself, humming between them like a song. Neither of them could hear, but both of them could feel. Recovery took months. Soren's wolf grew stronger with each passing week, the fading's damage reversing slowly as the bond poured warmth and life into the places the curse had hollowed out. He still woke some nights, with the echoes of Ashenmore behind his eyes, still carried the weight of the lives lost and the choices made. But when the darkness pressed in, Eloan was there, and he had learned, painfully and imperfectly, to let her be there instead of carrying it alone. The cord adjusted with varying degrees of grace. The political bride, the border healer, the foundling with no name and no bloodline, was the Alpha King's fated mate. Some accepted it, some whispered. One particularly bold noblewoman cornered Eloan at a state dinner and told her she did not belong at the high table. Soren, who had overheard from 6 feet away, leaned down and said, very quietly, "She belongs wherever she chooses to sit. And if you cannot accept that, I will be happy to arrange seating for you somewhere considerably further from the high table, permanently." The noblewoman did not raise the subject again. Months later, Aloan sat at the small desk in the reading room and pulled a fresh piece of parchment from the drawer. The cherry wood box sat beside her, full of letters she no longer needed to hide. She picked up her pen and began to write. Dear Mother, I am happy. I know that is a simple thing to write, but it has taken me a very long time to earn those 3 words, and I want you to hear them. He is sleeping beside me as I write this. His breathing is deep and steady and peaceful. His wolf is strong. His eyes are gold. He leaves me letters now tucked into my herb jars and between the pages of my books and once inside my left boot, which made me laugh so hard I woke him up. I think you would have liked him, Mother. I think you would have liked who I am with him. Someone who takes up room. Someone who is not afraid to be seen. Someone who is finally, after all this time, enough. I will keep writing to you. Not because I am lonely anymore, but because some conversations are worth continuing, even when the person you are talking to cannot answer back. I love you, I miss you, and I am home. She slipped the letter into the cherrywood box with all the others and let the clasp fall shut. Behind her, the fire crackled low. Beyond the window, snow fell softly over Thornholt, blanketing the palace in white. And in the next room, the Alpha King slept soundly, dreaming of nothing at all, while his mate's handwriting dried in the warm light, and the world outside turned quiet and still and new.